In 1648, screams echoed through the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace as Gulbahar Hatun was dragged toward the Bosphorus. But that's not even the worst part of what I'm about to tell you. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you think you know about Ottoman palace life. I'm going to reveal 3 torture methods so brutal, so systematically cruel, that historians have been burying these stories for over 400 years. First, you'll see how unfaithful women were sewn alive into weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus, but that was considered merciful. Then, I'll show you the iron cage lined with fish hooks, where victims were suspended for days, their own weight tearing their flesh apart. Finally, the most horrifying method of all, one so psychologically devastating that even hardened executioners refuse to carry it out. But here's what nobody tells you: the real conspiracy wasn't just the torture itself. It was how European historians deliberately erased these records to control the narrative about civilized versus barbaric empires. If you want to uncover historical truths they don't want you to know, hit that subscribe button right now, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why these secrets stayed buried for centuries. Picture this: it's 1650, and the Ottoman Empire stretches from Vienna to Yemen, controlling 3 continents. But here's what your history textbook never mentioned: the real power wasn't held by the Sultan alone. The imperial harem wasn't the romantic paradise Hollywood shows you. It was a political machine where 400 to 800 women fought brutal battles for survival and influence. The Sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan, wielded more power than most European kings. One wrong move, one suspected betrayal, and you'd face punishments that make medieval dungeons look like luxury hotels. But here's where it gets disturbing, and why I need to tell this story. For centuries, Orientalist historians painted the Ottoman Empire as exotic and mysterious, focusing on silk curtains and perfumed gardens. They deliberately ignored the systematic brutality because it didn't fit their narrative of European superiority. What I'm about to show you comes directly from Ottoman imperial records, Venetian diplomatic correspondence, and archaeological evidence that surfaced during 20th century renovations. These aren't myths or legends, these are documented historical facts that have been systematically suppressed. Imagine you were a concubine in 1648. You've spent years climbing the palace hierarchy. You finally catch the Sultan's attention, but then someone whispers poison in his ear about your loyalty. In the next few minutes, you'll discover exactly what happened to women like Gulbahar Hatun when that suspicion fell on them. What you're about to learn will destroy everything you thought you knew about palace life, about historical narratives, and about who gets to tell the stories that survive. Don't click away, because the first method I'm about to reveal was just the beginning of unthinkable cruelty. Let me take you back to that night in 1648. Gulbahar Hatun, once the Sultan's favorite, now trembles in the palace dungeon. The charge: suspected infidelity with a palace guard. Her punishment: the keys, the drowning sacks. But here's what nobody tells you about Ottoman record-keeping: they documented everything. The imperial executioners' logs from the 1650s, discovered in Ottoman archives, described this process in horrifying detail. First, they stripped the victim completely. Then came the humiliation. Palace servants jeered and spat as executioners forced her into a thick leather sack. But here's the truly sadistic part: they didn't just throw her in. They sewed her inside while she was still conscious, using thick cord that cut into the leather as she struggled. Imagine you're in that sack. The leather sticks to your skin. You can barely breathe. Every movement makes the cord tighten. You hear the executioners above you discussing the weather, their dinner plans, as if you're already dead. Then came the weights, stones tied to the bottom of the sack to ensure you sank quickly. The records show they used exactly 47 pounds of stone. Why 47? Because that was enough to drag you down but not enough to kill you instantly from the impact. The Venetian ambassador, Giovanni Soranzo, witnessed one of these executions in 1656. His secret report describes hearing screams from underwater for nearly 2 minutes before the bubbles stopped rising. But here's what's truly disturbing: this wasn't rage or passion, this was calculated political theater. The Sultan needed other concubines to see what happened when loyalty wavered. The splashing, the screams, the bubbles, all of it was designed to echo through the palace halls. You're probably thinking this was the worst they could do. You're wrong. The drowning sacks were considered merciful because death came relatively quickly. The executioner's logs mention this specifically. They note that drowning was reserved for minor infractions. But what about major betrayals? What happened when someone posed a real threat to the Sultan's power? Don't click away yet, because what I'm about to show you happened in underground chambers that most palace residents never even knew existed. The next method was so brutal that even hardened executioners requested transfers rather than carry it out. Deep beneath Topkapi Palace, in chambers that don't appear on any tourist map, stood what Venetian records called La Gabbia Infernal, the infernal cage. Picture an iron cage, roughly 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide. Now imagine every single bar lined with fish hooks. Not small ones, but massive iron hooks designed to catch sharks in the Black Sea. The victim was stripped naked and locked inside, forced to stand in the center, surrounded by hundreds of razor-sharp points. But here's the psychological torture that makes this truly horrifying: they weren't trying to kill you quickly. The cage was designed so that if you stood perfectly still in the exact center, the hooks wouldn't touch you. The torture was in the waiting, the knowing that one wrong move, one moment of weakness, would tear your flesh apart. Ambassador Lorenzo Bernardo's secret diplomatic correspondence from 1580 describes witnessing this punishment. He writes, "The condemned woman stood motionless for 6 hours before her legs began to shake. The first hook caught her shoulder blade. Her scream echoed through stone corridors. I pray never to walk again." Imagine you're in that cage. Your legs are cramping. Your back aches. You need to shift your weight, but every direction means metal piercing your skin. You hear footsteps above, palace life continuing normally while you're trapped in this nightmare. The truly sadistic detail: they placed the cage directly under the harem's main dining hall. The women above could hear everything, every gasp, every whimper. Every time the hooks found flesh, it was a constant reminder of what awaited traitors. The Venetian records show that victims typically lasted 18 to 24 hours, not from blood loss. The hooks were positioned to cause maximum pain with minimal bleeding. They died from exhaustion, from the stress of maintaining perfect stillness while their muscles betrayed them. But here's what nobody tells you about palace politics: this wasn't random cruelty. The cage was reserved for women who posed genuine political threats, concubines who tried to poison rivals, who passed secrets to foreign ambassadors, or who challenged the Valide Sultan's authority. You think that's the worst of it? You're not ready for what comes next. The cage, at least, offered a chance at survival if you were strong enough. But the Sultan's favorite psychological torture removed even that hope. The next method was so horrifying that when French archaeologists discovered evidence of it during 1920s renovations, they initially refused to publish their findings. In 1923, French archaeologist Henri Prost made a discovery in Topkapi Palace that would haunt him for the rest of his life. During renovations of the palace's eastern wall, workers found human skeletons sealed inside the masonry. But these weren't ancient burials, they were executions. The most horrifying part: the positioning of the bones showed these people had been walled up alive. Finger bones were found scratched down to nothing against the stones. Skulls showed fractures from beating against walls, and carved into the stone, archaeologists found desperate messages scratched with fingernails. But here's what makes this truly disturbing: it wasn't random. Palace records show this punishment was reserved for the ultimate betrayal, attempting to assassinate the Sultan or his heir. The victim would be sealed into a specially constructed cavity in whatever wall was being built or renovated at the time. The process was calculated psychological torture. First, they forced you to watch them mix the mortar. Then, they made you step into the cavity yourself, because if you refused, your entire family would share your fate. The executioner's records note that victims were given a small oil lamp that would burn for approximately 4 hours. Imagine you're sealed inside that wall. You have 4 hours of light to contemplate your situation. You can hear the masons outside joking as they place each stone. The oil burns lower. Soon, you'll be in complete darkness with just enough air to survive for days. The archaeological evidence shows that victims survived an average of 3 to 5 days. How do we know? Because palace servants reported hearing tapping from inside walls for days after executions. The Sultan would sometimes hold audiences in rooms where the tapping could be heard, ensuring everyone understood the consequences of betrayal. French archaeologist Robert Mantron's 1965 analysis of the remains revealed the most disturbing detail of all: teeth marks on the stones. In their final hours, victims bit the masonry so hard they shattered their own teeth trying to break free. But here's where this story takes an even darker turn. In 1959, Turkish historian Halil İnalcık discovered something that changed everything we thought we knew about these punishments. Hidden in the basement of a demolished house in Istanbul, he found documents that proved European historians hadn't just ignored these methods, they had actively worked to suppress them. The most horrifying revelation wasn't found in any archive. It was in how the story of Ottoman brutality was deliberately erased from history. And the reason why will shake your faith in everything you've been taught about the past. What Turkish historian Halil İnalcık discovered in that basement changed everything. Among the documents was correspondence between 19th-century European historians and Ottoman officials. They weren't just recording history, they were actively negotiating what parts of it would survive. Here's the conspiracy nobody talks about: European Orientalist scholars deliberately suppressed evidence of Ottoman torture methods because it didn't fit their narrative. They needed the Ottoman Empire to be exotic and mysterious, not systematically brutal. Why? Because admitting Ottoman sophistication in cruelty would force them to confront similar methods in their own empires. The British were simultaneously perfecting torture techniques in India. The French were experimenting with psychological warfare in Algeria. The Spanish had their own horrific methods in the Americas. But by focusing on Ottoman barbarity, European scholars could position their own empires as civilized by comparison. Dar. İnalcık's documents revealed a systematic campaign. The British Museum acquired and then lost Ottoman execution records. The French National Library classified torture documentation as too sensitive for public access. German Orientalists published sanitized versions of palace life that removed all references to systematic punishment. But here's what's truly disturbing: this wasn't just academic censorship. It shaped 300 years of Middle Eastern stereotypes. By portraying Ottoman brutality as Oriental despotism rather than calculated political control, European historians created the narrative framework that justified later colonial interventions. The real evidence was hiding in plain sight. Ottoman court records were incredibly detailed. They documented everything because the empire ran on bureaucracy, not chaos. But European scholars cherry-picked passages that supported their despotic East versus civilized West narrative. Modern Turkish historians like Bakit Sekin and Gonhan Bareksi have spent decades reconstructing these suppressed records. What they found is even more disturbing than the torture methods themselves. They've discovered that similar techniques were being used simultaneously across all major empires of the period. The torture methods I've described weren't uniquely Ottoman, they were standard imperial practice. The drowning sacks? Used by Russians against Cossack rebels. The cage of hooks? A variation appeared in French prisons during the same period. Living burial? Spanish Inquisition records describe identical punishments. But by attributing these methods exclusively to Ottoman barbarity, European historians could maintain the fiction that their own empires were morally superior. The conspiracy wasn't just about hiding Ottoman brutality, it was about hiding the universal nature of imperial cruelty. Today, these suppressed Ottoman records are finally being digitized and translated. Turkish scholars are working with international historians to reconstruct the complete picture. What they're finding suggests that every major empire of the 16th and 17th centuries used similar systematic torture as political control. The question isn't why the Ottomans were uniquely cruel. The question is, why have we been taught they were when the evidence shows imperial brutality was universal? These weren't isolated incidents of sadistic individuals, they were systematic political tools designed to maintain imperial control through terror. The drowning sacks, the cage of hooks, the living burials, every major empire had equivalent methods. But here's what connects to today: similar cover-ups are happening with historical narratives right now. Which empire's brutal methods are being sanitized in current textbooks? Which stories are being buried because they don't fit convenient political narratives? The Ottoman Empire fell over a century ago, but the battle over who gets to tell their story continues. Every time we uncover suppressed historical evidence, we have to ask, what else has been deliberately hidden? I know this was disturbing, but if you're still watching, you're clearly as fascinated by history's brutal truths as I am. Make sure you're subscribed, because next week I'm revealing the torture methods European empires used while they were condemning Ottoman barbarity.